President Biden is set to announce the apparent end to America's longest war. The president planning to withdraw the remaining 2,500 U.S. troops from Afghanistan by September 11th.
As Biden pulls the American forces out of one of the smallest and poorest countries in the Middle East, many may feel like the U.S. should bow in shame after failing to tame the wild beast that is Afghanistan. Even the American people have condemned the 20-plus-year campaign and its apparent failure, even after the fact that this was due to the tragic 9/11 that shook the world as we knew it back in 2001. As the Taliban returns to take control of most of the Middle Eastern country, what is taken for granted is the fact that they aren't the only global superpower that tried to take control of Afghanistan. A few decades before Osama bin Laden and his cohorts committed the abomination that attracted the wrath of the United States of America to Afghanistan, the Soviet Union, when it was still in existence, attempted to keep hold of Afghanistan, but the rains proved to be too hot for them, and in the end they were forced to retreat from the country, thereby relinquishing the control of the regime that they spent 9 years setting up. Even before then, the British Empire, one of the most powerful empires in the history of humanity, if not the most powerful indeed, failed to take control of Afghanistan, despite taking 3 separate swipes at taking control of the Afghan people, only to fail catastrophically. Therefore, it does beg the question, why couldn't any of these global superpowers take control of a country that currently has pretty much the same population size as cities like Tokyo or Los Angeles? How did they fail to take control of a country that is smaller than France in terms of landmass? Join us as we try to understand this odd curiosity. Let's find out why it's impossible to conquer Afghanistan. Perhaps the most obvious point to begin with this inquiry is the nation's geography. While most countries have very defined borders, Afghanistan's borders are pretty much a geographic suggestion or expression. To begin with, the Afghanistan that we know today only has borders because the countries that tried to conquer it tried to define its territory more than 100 years ago. They took little into account when they brought about 14 different ethno-linguistic tribes or groups, and today several of these tribes pay little mind to these artificial borders. For example, a good portion of the Pashtuns, which happens to be the most dominant ethnic group in Afghanistan, don't even live there. Instead, they'd rather be a minority group in their neighbouring Pakistan. When you look at a map of the Middle East, you may not even realize that is because the border that lies between both nations cuts through the Pashtun tribal area, thereby separating the 60 million people that make up the tribe between the two countries, despite the fact that this dividing border was set up by the British in 1893. To date, no other regime in both Afghanistan and Pakistan has thought it fit to rectify the matter. Even stranger still, both have failed to ratify it. As such, you can imagine that these Pashtun people pay little respect to this border. They tend to wander through both countries through the mountainous area that can be found in the weak border, as both countries have failed to take control of it. As you can imagine, this has made it easy for renegade soldiers who faced off against these superpowers to slip in and out of Afghanistan with ease. Even more disturbing for their enemies, it has given these fighters the perfect way to retreat, regroup, and return to battle before their enemies can even realize what's happening. As we alluded to earlier, neither the Afghan governments or the subsequent Taliban regime have granted any legitimacy to these borders and have failed to provide any sort of protection to them. As such, this is also a haven for the movement of contraband, such as money and supplies through the more than 200 recognized travel routes within such borders, as many within those areas appear to be sympathetic to the Taliban cause. No surprise that these borders have been recognized as the most dangerous on Earth. It's only in recent times that Pakistan has successfully built a fenced wall across the entire length of the border, just to limit this free movement of people. Don't let Donald Trump or the Republicans hear about that. However, as we alluded to earlier, this is only one of the problems that plagued those who tried to seize control of the country. Another problem these superpowers faced is that Afghanistan is a landlocked country. For those who don't know what that means, this simply means that Afghanistan is not bordered by any body of water. Instead, it's in the middle of several countries in Asia. As such, for anybody willing to conquer the country, they require the cooperation of one of the 6 countries that block the way to Afghanistan. And even if they manage to get some help from either Pakistan, Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and China, these troops would have to deal with the incredibly difficult Afghanistan terrain. Interestingly, despite being smack dab in the middle of the most populous continent on the planet by a significant margin, Afghanistan seems to suffer the ignominy of being one of the poorest countries in the world, perhaps due to the fact that its heavily underpopulated people seem to reside in a perpetually rural setting. This incessant poverty may also be due to the fact that there isn't much room for development in the mountainous country, as 75% of the landmass seems to be within the mountain peaks. Furthermore, half of the country's landmass seems to have an elevation of more than 2,000 meters, thereby making it one of the most mountainous countries in the world. As you can imagine, these mountains tend to act like a barrier to those who look to take the country from the grasp of its residents, as not only does it make it challenging for the invaders to get through, it also makes it difficult for them to transport their weapons and supplies from outside. In fact, these mountains are so formidable, Afghanistan communities have been forced to create a distinct world of their own from one region to another. And as such, it appears that this has limited the sense of nationalism that some other countries may have adopted over time, as these communities within the valleys seem to govern themselves autonomously. As a consequence, one can see how any central government that may have been formed over time has also failed to take hold of the entire territory within the weak borders. In fact, it seems like the only times these people come together is when they are forced to face invading countries, just as they did when the British, Soviet Union, and most recently the Americans tried to impose themselves on the Afghans. As such, enforcing total control over the entirety of Afghanistan means that these parties must be willing to take on each of these communities one by one, whereas one may have done so with a bit more ease to a country that actually has a central government. Furthermore, these valleys and mountains would also hinder any conquering efforts because the local forces will be able to hit these invading forces with guerrilla attacks, just like the Mujahideen did when the Soviet Union tried to seize their country. All they did was strike hard and flee before the Russian soldiers could regroup, thereby taking a page out of Sun Tzu's The Art of War, perhaps even without reading it. They would set up roadblocks in the mountains, which would make these poorly constructed and difficult to access roads even more inaccessible for months or even years at a time. Just take a look at the town of Khost that was cut off from the rest of the country by the Mujahideen during the entire war against the Soviets, and eventually the US by cutting off some strategic roads. Perhaps the most significant road out of all of these was the Khyber Pass, a path which gave the easiest access to the Hindu Kush within the Indian subcontinent and Central Asia for many millennia, and is one of the most strategic locations to take control of on Earth. After all, most of the supplies that were brought into the country by NATO and its member nations were brought in through that road. And as such, it was a major blow to these forces when the Mujahideen took control of it. In the decades before the war against the Soviet Union, the brutal Afghan government had attempted to build a circular highway that would connect most of the economic points in the country, but the subsequent civil wars and the conflict with the Soviets put an abrupt halt to that. Add in the conflict with the US, and this was only a pipe dream, as there were only a combined 50 kilometers of paved roads to speak of in the entire country, an unimaginable level of development to think of in most countries today. For comparison, France, a country that's smaller than Afghanistan, has over 1 million kilometers of tiled roads to speak of. As such, you can imagine how this lack of paved roads made it not only accessible for the various tribes living in the country, but also for troops and supplies moving around. As much as you'd want to blame this on the saboteurs, you simply have to look at the poor economic status of the country. With no funds to develop, coupled with the constant instability in the country, how do they even get something as simple as roads built? The harsh mountainous terrain and the at times unbearable weather may be a contributing factor to this underdevelopment, but the role of the conflicts in this country cannot be ignored. Couple that with the fact that it would cost millions of dollars for these roads to be completed, and the fact that the average wage of a person there is $500 per year, and you have a country stuck with problems larger than them. In conclusion, taking Afghanistan may be easy, but keeping it under the thumb is no joke. Couple the massive geography within a mountainous area that not only keeps the people divided, but also prevents enemy troops from taking total control of the country because it made them vulnerable to the guerrilla troops. If you do not have the cooperation of the citizens and neighbouring countries, it's tough to say that anyone will conquer that country anytime soon. Time and constant conflict has proved this fact, and only the future will tell if these conditions will be surpassed one day. For now, we can only watch as the Americans return home. This brings our video to an end. Do you doubt that these are the reasons for the failure to conquer Afghanistan? Do you think that other countries would have succeeded where the British, Soviets, and the Americans failed? Please tell us about them in the comment section. Don't forget to like and subscribe as well. Until next time, goodbye.